e-learning module on learning formative assessments. The traditional way to gather information about student learning is thorough summative assessment. Tests, sometimes teacher-generated, sometimes common across classrooms and content areas, sometimes standardized, given at the end of instruction for the purpose of measuring achievement. As teachers, we typically use the information from our tests to assign a grade and then move on to the next unit of instruction. As administrators and policymakers, we often use scores from standardized assessments to rank our schools or districts or states' achievement. These measures are valuable. They tell us where students have placed in the race, giving us a snapshot for comparative purposes. At this point, however, the race is over. In contrast, formative assessment gives teachers information that they can use to inform their teaching and improve learning while it is in progress, and while the outcome of the race can still be influenced. Formative assessment encompasses a variety of strategies. Formative assessment encompasses a variety of strategies for revealing students' understanding, allowing teachers to pinpoint and address any impediments to a student's progress. The process is much like a coach setting short exercises to assess a runner's stride, speed, and equipment, and then making appropriate adjustments so that the runner can improve. Teachers use formative data to decide how much and what kind of learning, support, and practice a student needs to reach the goal. When formative assessment is employed before, during, and after instruction, both teachers and students have a measure of progress. Achievement needs to be viewed not as a test-based number, but as a measurable growth over time. In this context, achievement means that students are working to improve their knowledge and skills. Different students will undertake this in different ways. Perhaps some taking smaller steps, but you know, than others, but progress is being made nonetheless. To go back to our race analogy, runners evaluate their achievement not only by where they place in the final standings, but also by how much their individual performance has improved. Formative assessment allows both teachers and students to measure learning by inches, ounces, and degrees. The results can inform teacher and student decisions about what to do next on an hour-to-hour, day-to-day, or month-to-month basis. Meet Ernesto and Mai, students in the same ninth grade pre-algebra class. Ernesto failed math in eighth grade, but was promoted due to the district's policy of not retaining students. Because of budget cuts, summer school classes were not funded at his school, and his parents didn't have the resources to pay for him to be tutored elsewhere. So Ernesto was entering grade 9 as the same genial but disengaged student he has become over many years. He has found that being the class clown is an effective way to distract teachers from their work and from truly knowing his abilities. Mai's family immigrated to this country a few years ago. She has been a reluctant learner of English, and her family and neighbors mostly speak her native language. As a student, she is well behaved, respectful, and cooperative. Her comprehension is sufficient for her to get by, but she is constrained in speaking because her verbal fluency and clarity are still limited intellectually. Maya is ready to study algebra, but the eighth grade teachers decided that she needed to work on her language skills in order to be successful with word problems and applying mathematical concepts. Traditional classroom experience. Let's begin this case study comparison by imagining Ernesto and Mai in a traditional classroom. On the first day of school, their teacher, Mr. Blankenship, assigns them seats in alphabetical order, and hands out a syllabus that includes topics and assignments related to the course goal. Students will demonstrate understanding of algebra by using algebraic symbols and variables, by simplifying algebraic expressions, by solving and graphing inequalities, and by evaluating, solving, and graphing linear and quadratic equations. As the weeks pass, Ernesto, Mai, and their classmates all listen to the same daily lectures and receive the same homework assignments. They are all tested at the same time with the same assignments. Grades are based on an average of all summative test scores. Mai does well with the numerical problems, but has trouble with the word problems. Her grades are average, and she is quiet and fairly disengaged in class. Ernesto has difficulty understanding many of the ideas in the textbook and is often baffled by the homework assignments, which he rarely completes or turns in. He begins bringing in chewed up pieces of paper into class, joking that his hamster ate his homework. By mid-year, Miss Blankenship has a sense that Mai will be passing the class, but Ernesto will not. In a classroom that incorporates formative assessment, Mai and Ernesto have a very different experience. On the first day of class, they take their seats at trapezoid-shaped tables that are arranged in rows. Their teacher, Mr. Major, comments that they shouldn't get too used to the seating arrangement because they'll be moving the tables around to sit in different places with different groups and partners depending on class activities. The students will eventually come to understand the varied groupings as the teacher's response to ongoing formative assessment data. Mr. Major also distributes a syllabus on the first day of class that clearly states the pre-algebra course objective. Students will demonstrate understanding of algebra by using algebraic symbols and variables, by simplifying algebraic expressions, by solving and graphing inequalities, and by evaluating, solving, graphing linear and quadratic equations. Because Mr. Major wants to be sure his students can relate to the lofty goal articulated in the syllabus, he attaches a handout with additional big ideas about math, such as how it is used in school, in the workplace, and in life. Numbers can show relationships between things, Mr. Major explains. We can analyze numerical data to guide decisions, and we can perform operations on numbers every day in the form of measurement, shapes, and graphs. He posts each of these purposes on large sheets of paper, distributes stacks of sticky notes, and asks the students to record some of the ways in which they use math in their daily life and attach these notes to an applicable purpose. Mai thinks of how her family struggles to make ends meet and their current calculations to figure out if they can afford to buy a car to improve their employment opportunities. On sticky notes, she writes, "Make a budget and save for a car." Ernesto tries to think of careers that don't require math, but quickly realizes that the sales and service professions he's thinking of use math skills. As the weeks pass, Mr. Major varies his instructional practices and uses pre-assessments and exercises like the sticky notes activity and quick writes to get a sense of what approaches will work best for various students. For example, Mai often finds herself working in small groups where it is necessary for her to find the words to explain her mathematical reasoning. Mai realizes that when she has classmates who can clarify what the word problems mean, she's able to identify the mathematical operations necessary to come up with a solution. Initially, the idea of working with others was intimidating, but over time, Mai overcomes her shyness. Working with and talking with others gets less and less intimidating. Outgoing Ernesto relishes the opportunity to work with others. Sometimes he's grouped with other students who are struggling with the same concept that he is, and they all get directed instruction from Mr. Major. Other times, the members of his group have a varied range of understanding, and they help one another learn. In this environment, Ernesto finds he doesn't feel as exposed or threatened. It's okay to admit he doesn't understand something when it's clear that others don't understand either. He also likes how the various activities in class keep things from being boring. Mr. Major doesn't just talk and assign problems, he gets everybody involved. For example, one day they all left the classroom and labeled things around the school that displayed a mathematical construct. They returned to compare and contrast the various findings, which they captured in a Venn diagram. Mr. Major's approach also makes it easier for Ernesto, Mai, and their classmates to stay on top of the assignments. They each keep a notebook of concepts, assignments, reflections, and homework, which Mr. Major collects and reviews every 3 weeks, and then returns with personal comments. Ernesto is especially pleased when his teacher notes his improvement in representations of algebraic expressions. He also finds suggestions and practice problems for building his capacity for evaluating algebraic expressions. Mr. Major's comments to Mai help her realize that she is very good at solving algebraic equations for the variable, and this makes her feel more confident about her abilities to tackle the new challenges. Mr. Major presents her with word problems in her folder that require her to use her English to solve them. Every time is different in this classroom. The reviews are student focused and include a variety of questions and summarizing strategies. Mai is very relieved when Mr. Major explains to her that she'll be able to use a translator when tackling the test's word problems. Mr. Major tells Ernesto that he'll have the opportunity to complete only as much of the test as time allows. There will be no penalty for not completing every item. Because the test is sequenced by difficulty, Ernesto feels confident until the last few questions and doesn't get discouraged or feel tempted to give up. After the test, he receives additional practice materials related to the questions he found most difficult or didn't get to. Mai receives her own customized set of follow-up materials, complete with some learning extensions and exercises that ask her to apply concepts that she understands well. Research supports that what we all know about teacher practice and student success. Student success is largely dependent on teacher practice, Jennifer King Rice asserts. Teacher quality matters is the most important school-related factor influencing student achievement. Marzano states that the impact of decisions made by individual teachers is far greater than the impact of decisions made at the school and district level. One of the primary functions of formative assessment is to inform instruction by providing information about student understanding relative to goals, objectives, and standards. Formative assessment helps teachers to target their instructions for greater effectiveness and make responsive instructional adjustments. In this respect, teaching and assessing are intertwined. The overlap is beneficial to students in that they regularly receive feedback in the course of learning, and it's beneficial to teachers because they regularly receive information about their teaching. With formative assessment, teaching and assessing become a cyclical process for continuous improvement, with each process informing the other. See Figure A. The advantage of formative assessment. Figure A. The cycle of formative assessment. The advantage of formative assessment. When asked to describe how routine use of formative assessment affects their classroom, Teachers typically observe that it helps form instruction on informed priorities, allows for customized learning, helping to build both basic skills and high-level learning in a way that is relevant and responsive to all learners. It encourages teachers and students to work together toward achievement. It increases student engagement and motivation. It ensures grades accurately reflect students' progress towards standards and increases coherence between curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Secondary level imperative. Teachers and students at both primary and secondary levels benefit from formative assessment. Although the material in this book will be relevant to you and your students, regardless of the grade you teach, there are chosen examples that emphasize formative assessment's use at the secondary level. In elementary schools, where the instructional emphasis is on basic literacy and numeracy, teaching and tests typically align with clear curriculum standards. For example, early readers are measured on phonemic awareness, reading comprehension, and fluency. Teaching is specific to these skills, and achievement is measured through reading readily available measures, such as DIBELS, dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. The secondary level imperative. Contrast this with secondary school, where content knowledge is less explicit and the measures are less consistent. Consider, for example, this ninth grade science benchmark in the state of Connecticut. Understand how science and technology affect the quality of our lives. A high school science curriculum includes a very wide array of content, including cell structure and division, bacteria, viruses, DNA, genetics, chemistry, atomic structure, the periodic table, organic compounds, energy, heat, electricity, environmental conservation, the solar system, atmosphere, geology, and much more. Yet the standardized test for science may only have questions on sedimentary rocks, eye color, and recycling. For this reason, teachers frequently need to write their own classroom tests. Using formative assessment strategies can enable a school science teacher to tailor classroom assessments and teaching practices to gaps in students' mastery of the curricular goals. But the needs of secondary schools extend far beyond curriculum, teaching, and assessment alignment. A contemporary secondary classroom includes students with widely diverse backgrounds, readiness levels, and skills. Teachers frequently must meet the needs of a class of students with a span and abilities of 5 or 6 grade levels. Formative assessment, with its emphasis on pre-assessing to identify background knowledge and beliefs and on tracking individual learning, is an effective way for teachers to customize or differentiate content and processes to the individual student. Formative assessment can also boost student engagement and potentially reduce dropout rates. The high school survey of student engagement by the Center for Evaluation and Education Policy at Indiana University, using data from over 80,000 students in 19 states, found that less than half of students surveyed frequently discussed grades or assignments with a teacher. Almost half did not receive prompt feedback from teachers. Only 57% said that they frequently contributed to class discussions. Half said that they agree that they devote a great deal of effort to school, and only half said that they get to make choices about what they study at school. Providing frequent feedback and choices to students is an essential element of formative assessment, and research shows that as students see progress in their learning and feel supported by their teacher, they often experience a positive change in motivation. Recommendations of studies at the middle school level center on lack of rigor and accountability in the curriculum. Making Middle Grades Work from the Southern Regional Educational Board concludes that middle schools need to adhere to rigorous content that is aligned with standards and develop supportive relationships that include academic support between teachers and students. Formative assessment has been shown to contribute to both achievement of standards and supportive curriculum interventions. Preparing students for post-secondary education and for success in our swiftly changing global economy depends on fostering higher level and critical thinking skills. The new Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce asserts that the public schools are graduating students with minimal workplace competencies. The report encourages development of analytical and creative thinking skills, along with the ability to interpret information and manage people. There is emerging evidence that using formative assessment in secondary classrooms can help to bridge the gap between core knowledge and the higher level skills of analysis and application. Certainly, adopting formative assessment is not a guarantee for solving every problem facing secondary schools, but it has shown strong potential for ameliorating many of them. The information in this section has been gathered from numerous sources and aligned around three significant concepts. One, formative assessment is student-focused. Two, formative assessment is instructionally informative. And three, formative assessment is outcomes-based. It is an effort not to duplicate information available in other resources. The elements have been condensed and definitions have been condensed as well. If you would like to read more about the fundamentals of formative assessment, I recommend working inside the black box, classroom assessment for student learning, doing it right, using it well, and classroom assessment and grading that work. Formative assessment is purposefully directed toward the student. It does not emphasize how teachers deliver information, but rather how students receive that information, how well they understand it, and how they can apply it. With formative assessment, teachers gather information about their students' progress and learning needs and use this information to make instructional adjustments. They also show students how to accurately and honestly use self-assessments to improve their own learning. Instructional flexibility and student-focused feedback work together to build confident and motivated learners. In brief, formative assessment helps teachers consider each student's learning needs and styles and adapt instruction accordingly, track individual student achievement, provide appropriately challenging and motivational instructional activities, design intentional and objective student self-assessments, and offer all students opportunities for improvement. Formative assessment is student-focused. In practice, students in Mrs. Chavez's English class are studying character development. They have read about Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird and Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. Early in the unit, Mrs. Chavez asks her students to define a character trait and give an example of someone in literature or in real life who demonstrates that trait. She gathers their examples in a list, which she posts in the classroom. This is valuable information about the starting point for the unit. In this case, it helps the teacher determine whether she needs to clarify the concept of character traits or can move on with the application of character traits to literature. Based on the data her students provide, Mrs. Chavez decides to move forward. She arranges the class into random groups and asks each group to write all the character traits of Scout and that they can think of on individual yellow sticky notes, one trait per note, and then do the same for Holden Caulfield, this time using blue sticky notes. Then each group posts their responses on the original list of traits alongside each character trait. Areas of agreement and disagreement are discussed. Mrs. Chavez uses a questioning strategy to elicit information and to clarify any lingering gaps in understanding or accuracy. Following this, students work on their own to create a T-chart for each character using the left side of the T to list life experiences and challenges, and the right side to list how these factors have influenced traits and behaviors. Note that Mrs. Chavez has done very little lecturing or whole class teaching to this point, making for a very student-focused lesson. During instruction, teachers assess student understanding and progress toward standards mastery in order to evaluate the effectiveness of their instructional design. Both teachers and students individually and together review and reflect on assessment outcomes. As teachers gather information from formative assessment, they adjust their instruction for further student learning. In brief, formative assessment provides a way to align standards, content, and assessment, allows for the purposeful selection of strategies, embeds assessment in instruction, and guides instructional decisions. In practice, during a high school social studies unit on the development of American nationalism after the War of 1812, Mr. Sandusky uses a series of assessments to monitor his students' development understanding of the presented material. Mr. Sandusky begins with a pre-assessment focused on content similar to what students will encounter in the final selected response text. After reviewing the pre-assessment data, he concludes that his students either remember little of their prior learning about the material or haven't been exposed to these topics before. He has intended to begin the unit with a discussion of how the popularity of the Star-Spangled Banner fueled nationalistic spirit, but decides to alter those plans somewhat by having students read articles about the War of 1812, grouping them by readiness and assigning purposefully selected texts and readings. One group reads about the reasons the United States and Britain went to war. Another reads about specific events that occurred during the war. And a third reads about Francis Scott Key. Each group reports out, sharing information with the rest of the class. As the unit progresses, students keep track of their learning and assignments on a work along, turning it into Mr. Sandusky every day for a quick check. For example, they describe causes of the war, answer a question about Key's motivation to write the Star-Spangled Banner, and note the location of the battle he observed, about Baltimore's Fort McHenry. This is followed by a corners activity where students pick different lines of the song to analyze and respond to in terms of relevance to current events. Later, after a discussion of diverse opinions on the War of 1812, the teacher asks students to report one pro and one con viewpoint to probe students' understanding of the significant outcomes of the war. He asked the class to describe 3 specific changes in the power of the U.S. government that resulted from the war. In these activities, Mr. Sandusky works to align his formative assessment questions with the lesson's specific objectives, incorporate the questions into instruction, and use the information to guide future instruction. Formative assessment focuses on achieving goals rather than determining if a goal was or was not met. One of the ways it does so is by helping to clarify learning goals and standards for both teachers and students. Teaching and learning are based on these standards. Students know the criteria for meeting the standards and are frequently shown exemplars. Teachers give frequent and substantive feedback to students about their progress, pointing out both strengths and areas that need improvement. Teachers gain steps to move students closer to learning goals. Work is assessed primarily on quality in relation to standards rather than student attitude or effort. In brief, formative assessment emphasizes learning outcomes, makes goals and standards transparent to students, provides clear assessment criteria, closes the gap between what students know and desired outcomes, provides feedback that is comprehensible, actionable, and relevant, provides valuable diagnostic information by generating informative data. In practice, a curricular standard for 10th grade biology requires that students understand the chemical basis of all living things. In her classroom, Ms. Jefferson asks students to track their progress toward the specific objective of describing, comparing, and contrasting the molecular structure of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. The applied learning comes from explaining how these differences are exhibited by foods and that students eat every day. Ms. Jefferson uses a signaling activity to get a baseline assessment of where her students stand. Afterwards, she delivers a traditional lecture, beginning the lesson as she will all lessons by stating the specific learning outcomes students are expected to master, and then focusing on transitioning students from what they know to what they need to know. Students keep a record of their learning by recording specific content knowledge in lab report notebooks. In one section, they draw the molecular structure of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Later in the unit, they watch a video and fill in a provided empty outline, and then complete a lab in which they test a variety of foods for the presence of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and report their findings in their lab notebooks. Ms. Jefferson reviews these notebooks regularly to monitor student progress and understanding, provide specific feedback, and inform her instructional decisions. Other formative assessment strategies she uses include bump in the road and feathers and salt. As with most effective teaching methods and practices, individual teachers have probably used formative assessment throughout history. Indeed, we could claim Socrates as an early practitioner, peppering his students with questions that probed and provoked. He used their responses to measure their learning and guide his instruction. This is the primary attribute of formative assessment. Although teachers have long used strategies like the Socratic method and other forms of meaningful questioning, the term formative assessment is a relatively new one. Its contemporary use is often traced to Michael Scriven, who used formative and summative to indicate differences in both the goals for collecting evaluation information and how that information is then used. Scriven explained that while a program is in the planning and developmental stages, it is still malleable, and the information gathered from evaluation can therefore contribute to change in the program. He called evaluation for this purpose of improving formative. Once a program has been created and implemented, Scriven argued, evaluations can only yield information to determine whether the program has met its intended goals. Scriven called this final gathering of information a summative evaluation. Benjamin Bloom was one of the first to apply the concepts of formative versus summative to educational assessment, helping lay the foundations for the concept of mastery learning. The purpose of mastery learning was to ensure that students didn't move forward to the next level of learning until they had demonstrated mastery of the learning objectives set for the current level. The current concept in turn became the basis for modular instruction, widespread in the 1970s, in which students learned from self-directed packets or modules of instruction. When a student successfully completed one packet, he or she could move on to the next packet, proceeding through modules till all objectives were met. In theory, mastery learning resembles today's scaffolding, but in practice, students worked mostly in isolation without much teacher support and peer interaction. In the decades following um, formative assessment began to be more widely explored. States considered ways to embed it in standardized tests. Bloom continued his theoretical work, examining several issues relating to formative assessment. He identified two essential elements of formative learning: feedback for students and corrective conditions for all important components of learning. He also argued that formative information could be used to divide the class into cooperative groups based on the corrections required. From this point, teachers could differentiate instruction to meet the needs of individual students through selected teaching strategies and corrective responses. In New Zealand, Terry Crooks studied the effect of classroom assessment practices on students and reported on their potential to emphasize what is important to learn and positively affect student motivation. Crooks asserted that classroom assessment appears to be one of the most potent forces influencing education. Accordingly, it deserves very careful planning and considerable investment of time from educators. Around the same time, Sadler reasoned that assessment is most effective when students can monitor the quality of their own work through specific provisions that are incorporated directly into instruction. Perhaps the biggest step forward in the embrace of formative assessment came in 1998 when Paul Black and Dylan Williams completed a meta-analysis of more than 250 research studies on the topic. Their findings, published as Inside the Black Box, make a compelling case for formative assessment. Black and Williams' review concluded that there is no other way of raising standards for which such a strong prima facie case can be made. Inside the Black Box led the way for many educational leaders to define and apply formative assessment in classrooms, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. New Zealand, Australia, and Great Britain have been especially strong leaders in this movement. The recent groundswell is an interest in information creating an imperative to change how we think about and use formative assessment. In 1998, the Black and Williams study provided evidence that formative assessment can make a difference in learning at all grade levels. The review of research studies, journal articles, and book excerpts concluded that formative assessment shows an effect size of between zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.7, the equivalent of going from the 50th percentile to the 65th. An effect size is a comparison of a range of scores of students exposed to a specific practice to those of students who were not exposed to the practice. Black and Williams drew additional conclusions, each of which is worthy of further study. Success of formative assessment is highly related to how teachers use it to adjust teaching and learning practices. Effective learning is based on active student involvement. Enhanced feedback is crucial to improved outcomes. There is a link between formative assessment and self-assessment. More information about the Black and Williams study is available through the website at King's College London. The link is included here. At the National Research Council, Bransford, Brown, and Coughlin's work, How People Learn, became the basis for the book Knowing What Students Know, and drew the following conclusions. An assessment plan must come first, not last, in the educational process. Assessment by necessity integrates knowledge, skills, procedures, and dispositions. Assessment as a diagnosis of student progress shifts the emphasis from summative to formative. In a follow-up to Inside the Black Box, William Lee Harrison and Black examined the achievement of secondary students in math and science who were exposed and not exposed to formative assessment. Teachers involved in the study were trained and supported in their use of classroom-based formative assessment. The research team measured the effects of formative assessment on learning outcomes and found a mean effect size of 0.32 when exposed to the intervention. Also in 2004, Ruiz, Primo, and Furtak measured the effect of 3 formative assessment strategies: eliciting, recognizing, and using information in the science classroom. They found that the quality of teachers' formative assessment practices was positively linked to the students' level of learning. The research base for formative assessment will continue to grow, and we look forward to additional data that can strengthen the case for assessing formatively, help confirm the best practices for teachers, and pinpoint the most effective strategies for responding to data and for measuring formative assessment's effect on learning outcomes. In recent years, recommendation for including high-quality formative assessment as an integral part of a larger and more balanced assessment system has come from many groups and organizations. Among them, the Joint Committee on Standards for Educational Evaluation and the National Council on Measurement in Education. Content and level-specific organizations such as the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, the National Science Teachers Association, and the National Middle School Association have also endorsed formative assessment as a way to advance learning. Although influential organizations and educational thought leaders have reached a general consensus about the benefits of formative assessment, teacher education and training efforts lag behind. As research has shown, teachers get little training or support in assessment and often turn to their untrained peers for information. And we are left with a gap between what we know is effective assessment practice and how most teachers use assessment in the classroom. This deficit in teacher knowledge and practice was the basis of a doctoral dissertation that was conducted and concluded that secondary teachers continue to use traditional summative assessment that infrequently aligns with recommended strategies. Shepard summed it up well when she quoted this observation by Grau. Assessment and instruction are often conceived as curiously separate in both time and purpose. The key to high quality formative assessment is to intertwine the two. What teachers and students need is assessment and instruction that are conceived as a unit, employed as a unit, and applied as a unit. The most important thing you can take away from this discussion of formative assessment is the understanding that no single principle makes assessment formative. It is through weaving together of all the principles that high quality formative assessment arises and the blending of assessment and teaching occurs. For a quick overview of what these components look like woven together, see Figure 1.1, which shows the general flow of formative assessment principles. Here is Figure 1.1, the cycle of instruction with formative assessment. As you can see, objectives, goals, and standards, targeted instruction, information technology, data analysis, responding to data all make up the formative assessment process. Now let's consider what the cycle of instruction might look like in practice. A teacher preparing for a discussion of current events in an English, social studies, or other class might produce the following plan. You may not be familiar with some of the plan strategies, but I will present these in more detail later on in the training in the lexicon of strategies in Appendix B. Objective, goal, standard, differentiate fact from opinion in written text. Formative strategies, signaling in response to simple sentences read aloud by the teacher. Targeted instruction, identify points of fact as contrasted with expression of the author's opinion in a newspaper editorial. Formative strategy, a corners activity in which the teacher reads more complex sentences and students express their responses by going to fact or opinion corners. One student in each group presents the group's opinion, and the teacher leads a follow-up discussion. Informed teaching, the teacher gives examples of how writers extend fact into opinion, along with guidelines for distinguishing fact from opinion. Students read select text, color code, examples of fact and opinion, and record their responses in their work-alongs. Formative strategy, a think, pair, share activity in which students create a color-coded T chart with facts on the left and opinions on the right. This is followed by a whole class review of the charts to reach consensus. Data analysis, the teacher uses data gathered to chart individual and group learning outcomes and target areas of misunderstanding and areas where students need additional challenge. Formative strategy, a chart of students' progress capturing and reflecting on data gathered during signaling corners, the work sharing, the work along, and the T-chart. Responding to data, the teacher adjusts instruction and assessment as needed to readdress the objective more effectively. Formative strategy, adjustment to content, resource level of difficulty, grouping students for additional practice or expanded learning, and differentiating the final assessment. Finding the balance in assessment systems. Large-scale accountability measures have all been and will continue to be with us for a long time. The use of formative assessment does not preclude standardized testing, but rather contributes to a balanced assessment system. Summative assessment has traditionally asked students to definitively express what they know. It's akin to asking, are we there yet, or have we arrived at the intended learning destination? In comparison, formative assessment asks what route we are taking to reach the goal and in what way the teacher can assist in the journey. Formative assessment gives teachers continual information on student progress, information that supports decisions about how much and what kind of learning, support, and practice students need to reach the goal. In this model, assessment data come from a variety of activities rather than from a single assessment at the end. While formative assessment and summative assessment serve the same learning goals, the former is an ongoing process and the latter is a finale, the finish line at the end of the race. Use of standardized tests alone as the measure of knowledge does not typically lead to improved learning. There's little evidence that standardized tests have raised student achievement except in a few narrow areas, primarily at the elementary level. SAT scores have been generally consistent for many years, and most state standardized test results have flattened out during the past few years. If we want better standardized scores or higher final achievement for our students, we must begin at the classroom level. Research shows that the pathways to student improvement are aligned with formative assessment. Students need constructive feedback on how to achieve the targets and guidepost measures along the way, not simply feedback on whether they reach the targets or not. It is formative assessment rather than summative assessment that will make the greatest difference. Is formative assessment something new? No and yes. The goal of measuring students' progress in learning in order to determine how and what to teach them has been around at least since the time of Socrates. Today's movement to include formative assessment as a routine part of classroom practice, however, has its roots in work spanning the last 40 years. As noted earlier, Michael Scriven kicked things off in the late 1960s by coining the term formative, and others expanded and refined the idea over the next 2 decades. However, it wasn't until 1998 when Paul Black and Dylan William published their seminal article Inside the Black Box, Raising Standards Through Classroom Assessment, that the advancement of formative assessment in today's classrooms and schools began to gain momentum. Black and Williams' research led them to the conclusion that formative assessment can raise standards and improve teaching and learning outcomes. This evidence moved many educational leaders to define and apply formative assessment in classrooms, not just in the United States, but worldwide. How does formative assessment differ from other school reform efforts? A teacher once commented that the professional development sessions that kick off every school year always feature the reform du jour. Over the years, we all have seen many reforms come and go. Formative assessment differs from most in two important ways. First, it um, incorporates much of what research has told us about how people learn and about how best practices for measuring and improving that learning occur. Second, formative assessment focuses on the day-to-day interactions between the teacher and the students. Teachers routinely using formative assessment in their classroom practice have insight into what and how well their students are learning and know how to quickly adapt instruction to meet students' needs and further progress toward goals. So formative assessment is different in that it is not a reform, but a way to reform and inform education. How does formative assessment differ from other school reform efforts? Formative assessment's focus on informing instruction also means that it can be used in concert with other educational approaches. Whether you are interested in differentiation, constructivism, authentic learning, or standardized testing, formative assessment can help your students along the path to mastery. How does formative assessment differ from other school reform efforts? There are many definitions of formative assessment. Margaret Heritage describes it as a systematic process to continuously gather evidence about learning. Carol Boston explains that it is the diagnostic use of assessment to provide feedback to teachers and students over the course of instruction. Essentially, formative assessment is a process rather than a product in that it focuses on uncovering what and how well the student understands throughout the course of instruction. How does formative assessment differ from other school reform efforts? What makes any particular assessment formative is not the specific measuring tool employed, but how the information gathered from the tool is used. If a teacher uses information from a particular assessment to track learning, give student feedback, and adjust instructional strategies in a way intended to further progress toward learning goals, that teacher is engaging in formative assessment. How does formative assessment differ from other school reform efforts? Formative assessment is also a systematic way for teachers and students to gather evidence of learning, engage students in assessment, and use data to improve teaching and learning. When you use an assessment instrument, a test, a quiz, an essay, or any other kind of classroom activity, analytically and diagnostically to measure the process of learning and then, in turn, to inform yourself of your students of progress and guide further learning, you are engaged in formative assessment. If you were to use the same instrument for the sole purpose of gathering data to report to a district or state or to determine a final grade, you will be engaging in summative assessment. Does formative assessment work in all content areas? Yes, formative assessment is effective for any content area. It can be used in language arts, social studies, science, and math, and is equally effective in health and PE, the arts and vocational subjects. It also has potential as an interdisciplinary tool. For example, a pre-assessment asking biology students to summarize what they already know about cell structure yields information about vocabulary as well as content knowledge. The teacher can use the insight to inform instruction in both areas. How can formative assessment support the curriculum? Curriculum defines the content and sequence of instruction. It identifies the process and products of teaching and learning. Some curricula are broadly designed. Think of a scope and sequence or curriculum map. Other curricula include daily objectives, specific content, learning activities, and assessment strategies. How can, how can formative assessment support the curriculum? Formative assessment can support all kinds of curricula by providing essential feedback about what students are learning and how well they are learning it. Formative assessment includes strategies that each teacher can employ on a regular basis in the classroom to track learning. Teachers can then change the content and products of instruction to customize learning based on a student's achievement of curricular goals. In this respect, formative assessment guides curriculum through a reflective process focused on student attainment of the goals and standards. How can, how can formative assessment be used to establish instructional priorities? Through the consistent use of formative assessment, teachers can quickly gather data to determine whether students are mastering the goals and standards or there are gaps in students' learning. Teachers can then use this information to establish priorities for future lessons. For example, if the majority of your class has mastered a specific standard, you may choose to use instruction time to delve into that standard further or explore an applied aspect of it. If, however, formative assessment data indicate that your students need more instruction or more practice, then you may decide to reteach certain elements or assign more group exercises targeting a particular skill. In this way, formative assessment guides the establishment of priorities for teaching and learning. How can formative assessment be used to establish instructional priorities? Although data-driven instruction has become a current buzz phrase, it can mean many things. Some districts are disaggregating the data from standardized tests and using those data to pinpoint student strengths and weaknesses. Other districts are using the same information to develop common formative assessments, assessments given to students in the same grade and taking the same subject in order to measure subsets of standardized tests. These strategies have a documented purpose but differ from daily formative assessment in that the teachers cannot immediately and routinely use them to determine teaching priorities. How can formative assessment be used as a teaching strategy? As the saying goes, formative assessment is assessment for learning more than it is assessment of learning. In a formative assessment classroom, teachers still present information through lecture and demonstration and still set tasks. Students still complete these tasks and interact with the teacher and with one another. How can formative assessment be used as a teaching strategy? There are a variety of specific strategies associated with formative assessment that are designed to gather data related to student understanding and further instructional objectives. There's further information as we progress through this course that covers the applications of formative assessment before and during and after instruction, provides specific examples. The most important idea to keep in mind, however, is that formative assessment as a whole is a planned strategy carried out to improve learning. How is formative assessment used in grading? To answer this question depends on the teacher. This is a brewing controversy about, there is a brewing controversy about using formative assessment in grading, and it centers on whether or not to grade all students consistently at their level of achievement or to grade their growth toward mastery of standards. If a top student arrives knowing about 90% of the content and rises to 100% mastery during the course, a net gain of 10%, should that student receive a higher grade than a student who came in knowing 50% of the content and rose to 75% mastery, a net gain of 25%? How is formative assessment used in grading? If the expectation is that all students will master certain standards, then grading at the level of achievement will typically reflect the spread of abilities students bring to the class, combined with the additional learning they acquire. If we grade progress towards standards, then a student coming in at 50% and rising to 75% has learned more than the one going from 90 to 100%, and therefore grades will reflect their growth and final achievement level rather than just their final achievement level. How is formative assessment used in grading? Teachers who believe that grading should reflect growth towards standards include selected formative assessment data in grade determination. They typically do not count every formative activity toward a grade, but may factor in data used as benchmarks during instruction. The value placed on formative assessment data will vary among teachers, but generally it is weighted less than summative assessment data. Keep in mind that counting some formative assessment data and grading helps to fairly reflect the learning of those students who have difficulty with more traditional testing formats or experience test anxiety. For the purist who believes that grades should reflect only final summative assessments, the compromise is to report that final grade along with improvement indicators. The bottom line is that everything should be assessed, but not everything needs to be graded, and grades should reflect progress and results. Can formative assessment close achievement gaps? Formative assessment definitely helps to close the gap between what students know and what we want them to know. It makes both teachers and students aware of holes in knowledge or understanding, leading teachers to address specific content, provide additional learning strategies to fill in those holes, leading students to set goals and track their progress toward achieving them. In some states and districts, closing the gap means teaching specific test content, and others teaching students how to think and learn across a broad curriculum is thought more effective. Whatever system you may be operating under, formative assessment can help you close achievement gaps. What's the relationship between rubrics and formative assessment? Rubrics and formative assessment perform some of the same functions. When used in the formative classroom, rubrics help teachers monitor learning and instruction and also provide meaningful feedback to students. Analytical rubrics include defined criteria that reflect standards, and they have descriptions of varying levels of quality performance. When rubrics are given to students prior to an assignment, they help to clarify students' understanding of expectations. Teachers can adapt or adjust a rubric to give more weight to particular criteria in order to differentiate the assignment to meet the individual needs. Rubrics support revisions of student work because they make it easy for students and teachers to identify changes that need to be made to meet goals. Teachers find that rubrics make assessment more objective because work is rated only on the given criteria. The development of quality rubrics does take time and thought, but in the long run, they make assessment more consistent and efficient, and the same one can be used for both formative and summative purposes. How can I help my students understand formative assessment? Formative assessment can be a revelation to students who have come to think of themselves as dumb or as academic losers because it gives them a clearer idea of what they need to do to succeed. Master this material, acquire this knowledge, or develop these skills. The point of formative assessment is to inform and improve, not to pass judgment. Success breeds success, and motivation grows from it. Use formative assessment from the first day of class and be sure you scaffold to catch the students who need more support. Research shows that formative assessment is most effective with students at the lower end of the achievement spectrum. This is not to say that these students are less capable. Sometimes they are just disenfranchised and disconnected from traditional school subjects, and the feedback from formative assessment helps to re-engage them. How do I do this? The list of things that teachers have to do is a long one, stretching beyond simply teaching, testing, and reporting grades to engaging parents in their child's learning, participating in professional learning communities, PLCs, and responding to psychosocial dilemmas. But I trust that incorporating formative assessment is something that you are going to want to do. Formative assessment is one of the few proven strategies that directly support high quality instruction and effective assessment. We all want our students to be successful after all. That is why we become teachers. Teachers incorporate formative assessment because it improves learning and teaching. Try it and you'll see. How can I learn more? As a starting point for learning more about formative assessment, please consult the references section at the end of this training. Teachers know that learning gets embedded when it's observed, practiced, discussed, and taught to others. After we've completed this training, there will be various activities and peer reviews that will help you to apply your knowledge in the classroom.